Medellín, Colombia. A city teetering on the edge of chaos. Once known for its picturesque landscapes and vibrant culture, it has now become a battlefield. Not a war between nations, not a war fought with uniforms and battle lines, but a war in the shadows, where loyalty is bought and betrayal is paid for in blood. The late 1980s have turned the streets of Medellín into something unrecognizable. This is no longer a place where families walk peacefully to markets or where children play freely in open courtyards. Now, every street corner is a checkpoint. Every alley holds a secret, and every passing car could be carrying death. The people here know better than to look too closely at a stranger. They know better than to ask questions, because in Medellín, questions get you killed. Pablo Escobar, the most powerful drug lord in the world, is at war. But this is no ordinary conflict. He is fighting on all sides, against the government, against the rival Cali Cartel, and against those who were once his allies but have since turned against him. To some, he is a modern-day Robin Hood, a man who has built homes for the poor, a figure who has stood up against the rich elites who long ignored the people of Medellín. But to others, to those who know the truth, he is a force of destruction. A man who will kill anyone, burn anything, and tear the city apart piece by piece if it means keeping his empire intact. For Escobar, power is not something given. It is something taken, something enforced. And when that power is threatened, his response is swift, brutal, and absolute. The city has already seen bloodshed beyond imagination. Judges, politicians, journalists, anyone who dares to speak against Escobar is silenced. His cartel has killed in the shadows, gunned down men in broad daylight, even brought down a commercial airliner just to eliminate one enemy. But even as fear grips the city, Escobar is losing ground. The government is closing in. His enemies are growing bolder. He cannot allow this to happen. And so he makes a decision, one that will change Medellín forever. A message must be sent, a warning, something so catastrophic, so horrifying, that no one will ever again question who holds the power. He will not just kill his enemies, he will make the city itself tremble. Escobar orders the preparation of a bomb. Not a small explosion, not an assassination. Something far bigger. Something that will leave behind smoking ruins and shattered bodies. A car bomb, the deadliest weapon in his arsenal. What happens next will go down as one of the darkest moments in Colombian history. A moment when the war stopped being about money or drugs or power. A moment when the war became terror itself. And the people of Medellín, innocent, unaware, are about to pay the price. To understand the explosion that would shake Medellín to its core, we must first understand the war that made it inevitable. Pablo Escobar did not build his empire alone. At the height of his power, he controlled nearly 80% of the world's cocaine trade, funneling billions of dollars into his organization. But control in the drug world is never absolute. Rivals are always watching, waiting, looking for the first sign of weakness. And in the late 1980s, Escobar's grip on power was slipping. The Colombian government had declared war on the cartels, backed by pressure from the United States. Officials were cracking down, extradition laws were being enforced, and Escobar was running out of places to hide. But the government was only one of his enemies. The Cali Cartel, once his allies in the cocaine trade, had turned against him. They were patient, methodical, and well-connected. Unlike Escobar, who thrived on violence and spectacle, the Cali Cartel operated in silence, bribing politicians, buying law enforcement, and slowly chipping away at his empire. And then there were Los Pepes. Los Pepes, short for Perseguidos por Pablo Escobar, or People Persecuted by Pablo Escobar, was an alliance of former cartel members, government forces, and rival criminals, all united by a single goal: to destroy Escobar. Funded by the Cali Cartel and supported by those who had lost family, friends, and fortunes to Escobar's brutality, Los Pepes waged a shadow war against the Medellín Cartel. One by one, Escobar's men were assassinated. His properties were bombed. His businesses were burned to the ground. Escobar, the man who once controlled everything, was now being hunted. But Pablo Escobar was not a man who ran from war. He believed in overwhelming force. If his enemies attacked him in the dark, he would strike them in broad daylight. If they killed one of his men, he would kill 100 of theirs. And so, as his enemies grew bolder, Escobar made his move. A bomb. A statement. A massacre. One single act of destruction that would remind everyone, Los Pepes, the Cali Cartel, the government, that Pablo Escobar was still the most dangerous man in Colombia. The order was given. The bomb was being prepared. The city of Medellín was about to experience terror like never before. Escobar had ordered violence before, hundreds of times. He had sent sicarios, hired assassins, to gun down judges in their homes, to execute journalists in broad daylight, to make politicians disappear without a trace. But this time, he wanted something bigger. Something undeniable. He was no longer just fighting a war, he was making a statement. The target was chosen carefully. His enemies were no longer just the Colombian government or the United States. His war had grown personal. Los Pepes and the Cali Cartel had made it clear they wanted him dead. Now Escobar would strike back. He would remind them that Medellín was his city, his territory. Anyone who betrayed him would pay in blood. But there was a problem. The Cali Cartel's leadership stayed in hiding, surrounded by armed security in the capital. Los Pepes were unpredictable, always moving. There was no single person Escobar could kill that would end the war. So instead, he would kill many. Escobar's men received their instructions. They were to rig a car with enough explosives to tear through an entire city block. This was not a targeted assassination, it was an act of terror. A calculated massacre. The goal was not just to kill. It was to create fear. To remind every man, woman, and child in Medellín that Escobar was still in control. A single vehicle, packed with over 200 kilograms of dynamite, placed in a location where it would cause the most devastation. Escobar's enemies would learn that in his war there were no safe places, there were no innocent bystanders. Everyone was a target. The bomb was ready. The streets of Medellín were about to be baptized in fire. The car was nothing out of the ordinary. A typical sedan, the kind seen every day on the streets of Medellín, blending into the chaotic flow of traffic. But hidden inside was something far deadlier than anyone could imagine. Over 200 kilograms of dynamite, carefully wired, primed to unleash destruction the moment Escobar's men decided it was time. The cartel's bomb makers had prepared it meticulously. Escobar did not tolerate failure. The explosives were placed in a way that would maximize the blast radius, designed not just to kill the intended targets, but to send a violent message to the entire city. Windows would shatter, buildings would shake, bodies would be torn apart. This was not precision. This was devastation. The car was driven to its destination, parked in a strategic location. No one took notice. Pedestrians walked past, unaware of the ticking time bomb beside them. Street vendors sold fruit and coffee, children played nearby, taxis honked in frustration at the afternoon traffic. The city moved as it always did, oblivious to the death waiting in their midst. Inside the cartel's hideout, Escobar's men waited for the perfect moment. Their target, rival cartel members, government informants, or perhaps even an important figure tied to Los Pepes, was expected to pass by soon. But in Escobar's war, precision was secondary to spectacle. If the target didn't appear, it wouldn't matter. The bomb would still go off. The streets of Medellín would still run red. Minutes passed. The tension thickened. Then the order came. Trigger the explosion. And in an instant, the city of Medellín would never be the same again. At precisely the chosen moment, a single hand moved to complete the act. It was as simple as pressing a button, dialing a number, or flicking a switch. Just a small action, but one that would unleash a force so violent that it would be felt for miles. And then, a blinding flash, a deafening roar. In an instant, the quiet hum of the Medellín streets was obliterated by a firestorm. The car, once an ordinary vehicle, was now a weapon of unimaginable destruction. The explosion ripped through the street, sending a massive shockwave outward in all directions. Glass shattered in an instant, blown from windows 5, 6, even 10 stories high. Steel and concrete groaned as the force of the blast tore through them, sending deadly shards of debris flying like missiles. The ground itself seemed to shake. Bodies were hurled through the air like rag dolls, their screams lost in the roar of fire and collapsing rubble. Cars parked nearby were flipped over, their metal frames twisted and crumpled like discarded paper. Flames erupted, black smoke billowing into the sky, turning the afternoon sun into an eerie, flickering haze. For a few seconds, perhaps only 3, maybe 4, there was nothing but chaos. And then, as the initial blast faded, a silence far worse than the explosion itself settled over the street. A silence filled with shock, with horror, with the unbearable weight of what had just happened. Then the screaming began. Those who had survived, wounded and bleeding, stumbled through the smoke, their clothes torn, their faces covered in dust and ash. Others lay still, unmoving, lifeless. Some had died instantly, their bodies unrecognizable. Others had suffered wounds too terrible to comprehend, limbs torn away, burns searing flesh, eyes wide with terror in their final moments. In the distance, sirens began to wail, but they were too late. The damage had already been done, and as the city struggled to comprehend the horror, one truth became clear. This was not an accident. This was not a random act of violence. This was a declaration. Pablo Escobar had sent his message, and the world had no choice but to listen. The smoke still hung in the air, thick and suffocating, as the first responders arrived. Firefighters rushed to douse the flames, their boots crunching over shattered glass and fragments of human remains. Paramedics scrambled through the debris, pulling the injured from the wreckage, their hands soaked in blood. Some victims were still breathing, their bodies broken but clinging to life. Others lay still, their eyes staring blankly at the sky, their final moments stolen by an explosion they never saw coming. The street, once filled with life, was now a graveyard. Families arrived, running through the rubble, screaming the names of loved ones. Mothers searching for their children, husbands calling for their wives. Some found only silence in return. Others found horrors they would never be able to forget. The destruction was total, cars overturned and burning, buildings with their facades blown open as if struck by artillery. Pieces of concrete, metal, and flesh were scattered across the road, a grotesque reminder of the power of the explosion. The police stood by, some frozen in shock, others working frantically to clear the area. But what could they do? This was not a robbery, not a simple crime. This was war, and everyone in Medellín knew exactly who was responsible. Pablo Escobar. It was his signature, his message, his way of reminding the world that Medellín was his city and that anyone who opposed him would pay the ultimate price. The government wasted no time in responding. Within hours, the streets were flooded with soldiers, their rifles drawn, their eyes scanning the wreckage for any sign of Escobar's men. Roadblocks were set up. Helicopters circled overhead. The order was clear: find the ones responsible, eliminate the threat. But deep inside his hidden fortress, Escobar was already 2 steps ahead. He had struck first. He had chosen the time, the place, and the victims. And now, as the government scrambled to react, he simply watched. To him, this was just another move in a deadly game. A game he had played for years. A game where survival meant killing first, striking hardest, and showing no mercy. And as the fires in Medellín continued to burn, one thing was certain: this war was far from over. The streets of Medellín were no longer just dangerous, they were suffocating under the weight of fear. The explosion had done more than take lives. It had sent a message, one written in fire and blood. Every shopkeeper, every taxi driver, every family knew the truth. Pablo Escobar had declared war once again. But Escobar was not the only one with power. The bombing had not just angered the government, it had enraged his enemies. The Cali Cartel, his longtime rivals, saw the attack as an opportunity. Los Pepes, the ruthless group hunting him, took it as a personal challenge. And the Colombian authorities, pressured by the United States, could no longer afford to hold back. Within hours, the government launched a brutal crackdown. Entire neighborhoods were raided, suspected cartel safe houses were stormed, and anyone believed to be connected to Escobar was taken in for questioning, or worse. The streets became a battleground, soldiers patrolling every major intersection, armored vehicles blocking roads. Medellín, already a city of violence, was now a war zone. But Los Pepes were even more ruthless. They didn't wait for the government to act. That night, they struck back. One by one, Escobar's closest allies became targets. His lieutenants, his accountants, even his personal assassins, none were safe. Explosions erupted in the dark, gunmen stormed private homes, bodies were left in the streets as warnings. It was the same terror Escobar had unleashed, only now it was coming for him. The people of Medellín, caught in the crossfire, could do nothing but watch as the cycle of bloodshed continued. They knew what came next. More bombs, more assassinations, more innocent lives lost. Pablo Escobar had lit the match. Now, the entire city was burning. As the war escalated, the unshakable king of Medellín began to feel something unfamiliar: fear. For years, Pablo Escobar had ruled with absolute confidence. He had bribed politicians, controlled police forces, and built an empire so vast that it seemed indestructible. But now, the walls were closing in. His enemies were no longer just challenging him, they were hunting him. Los Pepes had made their message clear. His men were being assassinated one by one, their bodies left in the streets, riddled with bullets. His safe houses, once untouchable, were being bombed in the middle of the night. Even his family, once protected by his wealth and power, was no longer safe. Escobar had always been cautious, always paranoid. But now that paranoia consumed him. He no longer trusted his closest allies. He moved constantly, never staying in one place for more than a night. He avoided using phones, knowing that the government and the Cali cartel were listening. His security details shrank. He could no longer afford to have large groups of men around him, afraid that any one of them might be a traitor. He had once walked the streets of Medellín with arrogance, throwing money to the poor, acting as though he were untouchable. Now he was a ghost in his own city, a fugitive running from the very violence he had created. But even as the net tightened, even as his empire crumbled, one thing remained certain: Pablo Escobar would not go down without a fight. The war was far from over. The bloodshed had only just begun. The Colombian government had spent years fighting Pablo Escobar, but the bombing had changed everything. It was no longer just about taking down a drug lord. It was about proving that the state, not Escobar, controlled Colombia. The world was watching, and the government could not afford to fail. With full support from the United States, Colombian forces launched their most aggressive offensive yet. The Search Bloc, an elite unit formed solely to capture Escobar, was given one mission: find him and eliminate him. No more negotiations, no more deals. This was a manhunt, and it would end in only one way: Escobar's death. The military presence in Medellín increased overnight. Soldiers patrolled the streets, checkpoints were set up on every major road, and suspected cartel informants were arrested or killed without hesitation. Every asset Escobar had left was being cut off. His money was running out. His men were disappearing. His world was collapsing. But it wasn't just the government closing in. The Cali cartel and Los Pepes continued their relentless assault. They burned down his properties, bombed his remaining hideouts, and hunted his remaining allies. The king of Medellín had become the city's most wanted man. And yet, Escobar refused to surrender. Even as his empire crumbled, even as his enemies swarmed like vultures, he still believed he could outlast them all. He had evaded capture before. He had fought wars and survived. In his mind, he was still untouchable. But the walls were closing in. The government had intercepted his communications. They had tracked his movements. And now they had one final lead. One that would bring the most feared man in Colombia to his final stand. Pablo Escobar's reign was about to come to a bloody end. December 2nd, 1993. For the first time in over a year, Pablo Escobar made a mistake. A small one. Just a brief call to his family. But it was enough. The Colombian government, working with U.S. intelligence, traced the call to a small, nondescript house in Medellín. It was a modest home, nothing like the lavish estates he once owned. Escobar had been reduced to hiding in plain sight, a fugitive in the city he once ruled. The search bloc moved in immediately. The house was surrounded. Escobar had only one bodyguard left, a far cry from the army that once protected him. But even now, cornered and alone, he would not go quietly. As the Colombian forces stormed the house, gunfire erupted. Escobar and his bodyguard fought back, desperate, knowing there was no escape. Bullets tore through the walls, shattering windows, ripping through furniture. The battle spilled onto the rooftop where Escobar, wounded and bleeding, made his final stand. And then, 3 shots. One to the leg, one to the torso, and one final bullet straight through his ear. The body of Pablo Escobar, the most feared drug lord in history, lay lifeless on the rooftop. The man who had built an empire on violence, who had terrorized an entire nation, was finally dead. Medellín, and all of Colombia, breathed a sigh of relief. The war was over. But the scars remained. The car bombings, the assassinations, the thousands of lives lost. Escobar's legacy would never be forgotten. But what do you think? Was Pablo Escobar a criminal mastermind who met the fate he deserved, or was he a man who simply played the game too long? Let us know in the comments, and if you want more real-life stories of crime, power, and history's darkest moments, make sure to subscribe. There's so much more to uncover.